Dr. Chandrasekhar, I think we can start better. Even if somebody joins, let them join.
Can you see my? Are you able to listen me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Wow. Hey, it is apa? తీసుకోబో ఆమె తీసుకోబో ఫస్ట్ So let us start. I request everyone to mute. So good evening to everyone. On behalf of Satyashodak, I welcome you all for today's lecture on music and cultural labor. So this is the lecture series that we have planned as a part of lecture series on Dalit musical traditions. So earlier on this platform on Satyashodak, so we also organized successfully the lecture series on anti-caste Shudra intellectual traditions. So we could able to organize almost 14 to 15 lectures identifying the anti-caste Shudra intellectuals throughout India. So that was one of the successful lecture series which really created a productive engagement with both scholars, activists across India. So today we have a first lecture, which is part of the Dalit musical traditions. So the aim of this lecture series is to engage, discuss, and bring the neglected musical traditions of the Bojan communities across India. So though there has been a debate, discussion on the so-called mainstream music performers and their own instruments and so on and so forth. So there are people are engaged as a performers, scholars who have been doing research on the so-called mainstream music, performance, aesthetics, instruments, and so on and so forth. But one could see both in the scholars' discourse and activist circle, there is always a binary that has been constructed, and which has a long history. The musical, classical music and folk music. I think this is the one binary that constantly we listen in the discourse of music and music performance and so on and so forth. But however, given the caste hierarchies, graded inequalities that are deep rooted in Indian society, one has to see how the production of music and the performance of music, the instruments that are associated with the music traditions are in a way graded. Some musics are considered as a classics, some musics are impure, some are high cultured, some are low cultured, some are local, some are national. So one could see hierarchy of understanding, interpreting, listening those musical traditions. But however, the institutions before independence and after independence, the majority of the state institutions, government institutions are patronized and promoted, discussed the so-called classical musics and the people who are associated with those traditions. So if only few individuals and institutions are engaged with the subaltern musics, and I would say Bojan musical traditions in India. So therefore, this lecture series will engage seriously and bring the musical traditions of the Bojan communities across India, that is Dalits, Adivasis, OBCs, and some of the minority communities. So I would say that though there has been a great tradition because of a deliberate exclusion of this music and the performance of performers of this music and the theater and instruments, I think majority of the music instruments, whichever state you take, are produced by the Dalit communities. Take for example, Dappo from Telugu region. And the majority of the music instruments are associated with the leather. And leather is particularly associated with certain communities in Indian tradition. So one could trace out that link. And that's what I think today, now people are talking about Mrudangam in music tradition. And if you see if you trace out the history of making Mrudangam, it's certainly associated with the Dalit communities. But while Mrudangam become a part of classical music, and the makers of the Mrudangam are fundamentally excluded from that music tradition. So that's where clear negligence, deliberate exclusion, thereby negating these Bohujan communities' musical traditions. So that's where this lecture series become significant. And we have been thinking, so I have been thinking, I was discussing with some of the scholars when I had a discussion with the Kalyani, she's from JNU. She's doing research on Dalit music in North India. So we had a discussion, and I also seen the Brahma Prakash recent book, Cultural Labor. And when I saw that book, I immediately ordered for the library. And then we began to think, so there should be a beginning with the Brahma Prakash so that it will have a meaningful discussion. So with that background, so first lecture we thought up to have by Brahma Prakash. Today, to speak on this theme, music and cultural labor, we have with us Dr. Brahma Prakash, who is assistant professor in Center for Arts and Aesthetics, JNU. So, who has been doing a serious work on this, theater, music, and subaltern musics, non-Western aesthetics, and the range of issues that he is engaging clearly shows his commitment to the subaltern musics. He did his PhD in UK, and he also did his MA in Chinese aesthetics and philosophy in Taiwan, and he also did his MA in JNU. So he has been publishing. He has been publishing in international journals, reputed journals, and he got many awards and fellowships across globe. And if you see his CV, which is available on internet, you will clearly understand how he is seriously working, and his scholarship is really inspiring to the young generation of these scholars and activists. So I may not take more time. So you could Google is for his work. With this, introduction, brief introduction, I call upon Dr. Brahma Prakash, who will be speaking for 50 minutes, and then we will have a discussion. And meanwhile, so if please mute yourself, and if there is any disturbance, it will be a problem. So in discussion, you can directly pose question to Brahma Prakash, or you can message him. So this lecture is, we have recording. So later it will be uploaded to YouTube. And now I invite Brahma Prakash to begin his lecture. Thank you very much. Please unmute.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Chandraya Gopani, Dr. Chandraya Gopani, for giving me this opportunity. And also I would like to thank Kalyani Satyasudhak for starting this such a wonderful initiative. And I don't know the kinds of expectations that you have. I'm going to fulfill that expectations, but I will try my best to do whatever I'm doing in my work. So in today's talk, what I'm going to do, that it has two components. One that I would like to discuss.
In a way, great.
Yeah, so I would like to discuss in the first part, I would like to discuss this whole idea of the cultural labor that I have tried to develop in my work. And this is a kind of one way of conceptualizing the folk performance in India. And that has been a kind of attempt that I have been doing in my work for a long time. Second part, I will discuss about music and cultural labor that Dr. Chandraya has insisted me to speak on. And my recent work that I was doing has a lot of connection with the music. And especially it becomes interesting because if you are discussing about more Dalit Bahujan kinds of music and performing traditions, then we don't have that kinds of division. Because when you are discussing about music, then you are also discussing about dance, When you are discussing about dance, then you are also discussing about theater. And then we can think about more inter-genre kinds of connections that we can think about. So first, I would like to give you an idea about that, what I have done in my work, what I have done. So before I start, I would like to request Dr. Chandraya to, if he can play the video, that a small clip. And if it works, then I will get some kinds of resources to start my discussion.
Brahma.
Yeah. So thank you so much for playing this video. Again, the questions I started, like when I started writing this book, then question I ask is that what are the kinds of reasons of marginalization, why these performances are getting marginalized? And this was the kinds of fundamental question that I was asking. And then the questions suddenly have shifted, and then it became that what are the strengths of this performance tradition that we are discussing about. So largely my field was folk performance and the folk performance of the marginalized communities. I will say primarily the communities of Dalits and Bahujans. And then it was a kinds of very strange kinds of connection that I was able to decipher, and those connections were like how their strengths themselves are getting marginalized. And if we are trying to find out, so some of the questions that I am trying to discuss in this book are what are the organizing principles in which these cultural performance operate. So here, if somebody asks that what are the kinds of, so you have seen a performance, and if one asks that what this performance group have done, what they have created, whether they were able to create some meanings, whether they were able to change some kinds of landscape, whether they were able to generate some kinds of values, where they were able to create some kinds of meanings and effect. And then if we are going through some idea of representations, then it would be quite difficult to find out these kinds of connections. But if we are going through certain kinds of bodily movement, corporeality and other things, then of course they were able to generate some kinds of values and some kinds of connections. And that is the connections I'm trying to trace out, that what are the kinds of investment they are doing. So if you are asking about labor, then what is a labor? Labor we discuss in relation to values. Then the question we can ask that what are the kinds of investment they are doing, these performers are doing, and what the kinds of values they are trying to produce. And these were the two connections that I have tried to cross, try to examine in my dissertation, that time my dissertations. Second question that I asked, that what are the structures of healing that they engender in relation to values? What are the kinds of structures of healing? What do they invest and what do they produce? Third is what are the regions of their increasing marginalization? If you are thinking in terms of marginalization, then we can think about what are the kinds of increasing margins, why these good performance traditions are getting increasingly marginalized, and also what are their strengths and radical potentials. Because we cannot just discuss folk performance in context of some kinds of positive elements, that folk performance is always about some kinds of radicality, some kinds of very radical kinds of rupture. We know that folk performance is full of problems. It has its own kinds of complexities. It has own kinds of backwardness in that sense. And then even if we are considering those aspects of folk performance, then question arises that what are the kinds of radical potentials they can provide. So the connection that I could find out while discussing about these strengths are their relationship with the land and production. And this is the context, this is the larger context that gets completely marginalized if you are discussing in context of Sanskrit aesthetics, because neither you have some kinds of context with land, because land as a category gets completely erased. And you have now we are discussing I'm discussing and at the platform of Satya Sodhak, and then you have wonderful work by Sarad Patil, where he's saying that how our lens, in our whole cultural lens, this category of land, category of materiality gets completely displaced. And therefore, we think that whenever we think about culture, we think about leisure time. And unless you don't have leisure time, you cannot produce culture. And if you're thinking through this category, that unless you don't have leisure time, and therefore you cannot produce culture, then only upper caste can produce culture, because they are the community, they have the leisure time in that sense. And therefore, can we think, and then Sarad Patil provides a very offers a very interesting kinds of framework, and he suggests that how even Indian Marxists to that extent are borrowing their concept from Kantian, and to that extent Greek kinds of poetics, where they are thinking in context of culture as a part of some kinds of leisure activities. Second criticism come when you are discussing about Tagore. Tagore makes a very interesting kinds of distinction between Christi and Sanskriti. He makes that a whole distinction between agriculture and culture. And he says, he writes very he gives this emphasis that if you want to discuss about culture, then necessarily you have to erase this sense of agriculture, Christi, you have to get out of this sense of culture. And then question comes that if you have these kinds of erasure, if you have these kinds of displacement, then is it possible to think in terms of certain modes of aesthetics, and how these kinds of aesthetics regime can completely displace this whole notion of Dalit Bahujan aesthetics, that aesthetics and culture that we can discuss about. So relationship with the land and location, the centrality of the body, the visceral nature of performance, the contradictory appearance and choreopolitical possibilities. These are the 5-6 chapters that I have discussed in my book. And so every chapter have one conceptual category and one empirical kinds of performance. So I discuss about landscape and how especially in the North Indian context, because if you're thinking about Tamil Nadu, then in Tamil Nadu, still you have this context, this poetic category, Tinai, where there is some discussion happens around this landscape. But if you're coming to North Indian category, then whole idea of the land and landscape gets completely displaced. You don't have any discussion. Whenever you discuss about aesthetics, then you don't discuss about land. And once you are trying to marginalize this category of land and production, then of course you are completely trying to marginalize whole range of aesthetics traditions, and that becomes one kind of tradition. So when I discuss about landscape as a category and Bhunya Puja in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh region, almost in every caste community, not every caste, in Dalit Bahujan communities, you have these traditions of worshipping land. So when they worship their land, they worship their animals, they worship river, they worship different kinds of other kinds of material elements in that sense. And then through that connections, I am trying to bring this whole idea of the landscape, that how to reclaim that land, category of land and landscape. Because one other problems will happen, that if you are discussing about land, then how we are going to place Dalit community, who may be landless communities in that sense. And therefore, not necessarily we can go with the idea of the land, but we can still go with the idea of the landscape. And through the idea of the landscape, we can still reclaim some of those connections. Second chapter discuss about Videsya, and Videsya, if you translate, then it would be theater of migrant laborers. And then again, you have a very interesting connection. So if you think about Bihar and Bhojpuri migration and Bihar and UP region, then you have a lot of migration that happens to Delhi, to Mumbai, to other parts of India. And during the festival time, most of people, they come back and they organize their own kinds of theater traditions, theater performance, and it's called Videsya. And the founder was the person who founded this theater tradition was Vikhari Thakur. He himself was coming from Barbar community in Bihar, and he himself was working in Kolkata for 30 years as a migrant laborer. When he came back, then he tried to start Ramayana troupe, but then upper caste did not allow him that to how come a Barbar caste can do this whole Ram Lila and Ramayana troupe, can run the Ramayana troupe. Then he started his own kinds of troupe, and then his focus, he started telling his own kinds of stories about migration, the complexity, a struggle of the migration, about the migrant communities and all those things. And when I discuss about Videsya, then I discuss about materiality, that how when we discuss about certain kinds of aesthetics tradition, and especially about more Brahminical Sanskritic aesthetic traditions, then again, the notion of body gets completely marginalized. And even if you have the notion of body, then mentation and the mental mind becomes the central category. But if you're thinking about Videsya, if you're thinking about these categories, then body corporeality becomes the central category. And therefore, centrality of the body becomes the category through which I think about the second chapter in materiality. Third chapter discuss about visceral nature of performance, and you have Dugola performance now in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, that is again becoming very, very popular, and it creates a very instant kinds of musical composition. So for example, you have two singers, they rivals against each other, and instantly they compose some new songs or some new kinds of does some new kinds of creativity. So they may start many times with whole Ramayana Mahabharata things, but they can go to that extent that many times the songs become very obscene, many times it becomes very vulgar, but they many times it can also becomes very, very political, to that extent that now in Uttar Pradesh you have many Dugola performers, they are singing Ambedkarite songs, they are also singing Buddhist songs for that matter. So how some kinds of shift is also happening. But what I'm discussing about that visceral nature, that how visceral nature of performance, and if you have that whole visceral nature of performance where the things does not maintain a kinds of categories, purity, or so always you can mix some categories with some categories. So you are thinking about food, but you can also think about decayed place. And if you're trying to mix food and decayed place, then again it becomes a certain kinds of category that gets quite challenged in a Brahminical notion of aesthetics. And after that, I discussed about contradictory appearance. One of the things that, like, many times whenever we discuss about Dalit Bahujan aesthetics, then they will say, oh my God, it's very contradictory. It's very like, no, it does not maintain one kind of like, no. But again, we need to think about that, like, no, you have work by a Scott, and a Scott will say that how many times because of certain kinds of operation, and if you have extreme kinds of operation, then community may not come out and like, no, openly speak about their operations, and they may maintain a hidden scripts, and they maintain a kinds of like, no, public transcripts. So their public transcripts and hidden transcript will be very, very different. So what they are saying in the public may be very, very different when they are saying like, no, in a kinds of hidden ways. And you have interesting examples that is coming from Resma Chuharmal performance in Bihar. And I don't know how many of you know about this performance tradition, because Chuharmal is coming from Dusad communities in Bihar, Dalit communities, and Resma is coming from Bhumihar communities, like, no, Bhumihar caste. And both, like, this whole story, love epic, it is basically love epic. And what happens in this love epic, that like, no, Chuharmal and Resma both fell in love with each other. But what happens in this story, both are getting killed. But again, you have like 21 different kinds of interpretation in one village. They are told by different caste. Even like, no, the way male tell this story, like women tell this story in a different ways. So you have different kinds of interpretation of these stories. But what I am like a point that I am trying to say here, that when they worship Chuharmal in their own household, Dusad community worship Chuharmal in their own household, then you have a whole narrative that is a very grotesque kinds of image. They produce very grotesque kinds of image of Chuharmal. So Chuharmal is a very grotesque image. Chuharmal is getting killed, and he's becoming a kinds of like a more malevolent deities. But when same communities, when they are trying to bring Chuharmal in a public space, more a social space, where other caste groups are also coming to watch these kinds of performances, then they will say that Chuharmal is Rama Avatari. Chuharmal is like, no, Chuharmal to hamare Ram ke avatar hai. Now the question comes that why in the same time, and at like the same time, like if you're thinking about same temporal kinds of things, one communities are creating two different kinds of image of Chuharmal. They can say that, okay, Chuharmal is a malevolent deity, or they can say that Chuharmal is a Rama Avatari. But why they are maintaining two different kinds of images of Chuharmal? And I think that one can argue that because if you're thinking in terms of a strategy, like every struggle has to have some kinds of a strategy. And if you're thinking in terms of a strategy, then maybe in their own household, they'll be like, no, this grotesque image of Chuharmal is just still making some kinds of presence. But when they are coming to like, no, more social kinds of a sphere, then this Rama Avatari, what they say, beautified image of Chuharmal, are able to provide a different kinds of resistance. And therefore, maybe the communities are producing two different kinds of image. But this story also have two other kinds of narratives. So when Grierson was writing about Bihar in like during the colonial period around 1910, then he's considering Chuharmal as a kind of thief. Many times he also writes Chuharmal as a like a spirit deity. But sorry, but what happens? Then what happens that like during when the Communist Party movement, like Communist Party of India is becoming strong in that region, then Chuharmal is becoming suddenly a communist hero. When Maoist movement is becoming strong, then Chuharmal is becoming a Maoist hero. To that extent, when like Ram Vilas Paswan tried to give Chuharmal the image of Dalit hero. So from like different how Chuharmal with the time and with the space are able to create a different kinds of image and are able to produce a different kinds of a strategy and narrative in that sense that I have tried to discuss. And finally, I discuss, and I think many of you are coming from South India, then I also discuss about Gadar and Jannat Mandli. And the question that I asked that what could be the regions that like the kinds of attack that group have faced, Gadar and Jannat Mandli have faced in Telangana and Telugu region are quite unparalleled in India, almost unparalleled in India, because you already have like Communist Party had cultural troop in Bengal. They had a cultural troop in different parts of India, but nowhere the kinds of attack that like a state was so violent on the troop that like for example, Gadar and Jannat Mandli has witnessed in Telangana. So this has been, and then I discuss about choreo politics. So in this chapter, I bring like Gadar and Jannat Mandli through choreo politics. So maybe the politics is not enough, and you have like Hannah Arendt, and Hannah Arendt makes a very interesting kinds of argument, and she says that we know how to talk politics, but we don't know how to walk politics, and the point is to walk politics. And So what happens when we're trying to walk politics, not only talk politics, when you're trying to walk politics, and then if you're trying to like reclaim some of those categories, what is happening in Gadar and Jannat Mandi, that of course they are trying to bring the language from the below, they are trying to bring the language from the Dalit and Bahujan caste, they are trying to reclaim the category of the land, they are trying to reclaim the category of the bodies, and therefore the performance becomes a threat for the state and for the feudal and upper caste society. So this has been a larger kinds of canvas, like canvas in which I have tried to trace this whole genealogy of like why some of those performances are getting marginalized and how their own strengths are getting like if you're thinking in terms of their strengths, because these kinds of aesthetics regime trying like generally try to marginalize these kinds of either category of land, the category of the body, the category of certain kinds of like deception or certain kinds of performativity, and therefore this performance becomes like complex. So in like in Gadar and Jannat Mandi, like the chapter is called Choreopolitics, reclaiming cultural labor in the act of Gadar and Jannat Mandi, beyond choreo police and transgressive purification. Because many times what happens that we have seen even in Bahujan kinds of politics in Uttar Pradesh, for example, I have seen that I have seen one event where like Prime Minister is coming to Banaras, and then they are trying to like garland Madan Mohan Malviya, and then one party is going and trying to wash that statue with milk, and then Samajwadi party is coming and washing that statue again with the milk. That somebody, then it becomes a kind of like you are trying to provide some kinds of resistance, but resistance still can be considered as a transgressive purification. You are still operating within the kinds of purificatory kinds of paradigms. So what does happens when they reclaim their strength on their own terms? What happens when any radical groups for that matter, or for that matter like Gadar and Jannat Mandi try to reclaim their strengths? The performance becomes a threat for the state and society. Second, what made the JNM artists so vulnerable? And one can find that why the state becomes so violent against Gadar and Jannat Mandi, because they were reclaiming the whole radical kinds of elements. And also it was like they are doing some kinds of reinvention of bodies. Like it was not just about like you are singing a kinds of radical revolutionary performances. You are also trying to project the bodies in a different ways. You are also trying to bring some kinds of movement that was earlier part of the certain kinds of like ghettos. Now ghetto is becoming the part of the public sphere, and when ghetto becomes the part of the public sphere, then it also generates its own kinds of complexities. Yeah, so this was this was a kind of larger context in which I have tried to work on this idea of the cultural labor. I will just give you a whole definition. I will try to read some parts that how I'm trying to define the cultural labor, and I think that will give you a sense. So it is the sense and enactment of intense, passionate, ritualized, and aestheticized forms of production of values in a specific cultural context that I call cultural labor. Cultural labor is a creative economy placed in a hegemonic local context. Like immaterial labor, which maintains its global network, cultural labor maintains its local networks. In this background, cultural labor is an attempt to bring culture and labor both in its entwined as well as in intertwined performative mediation. It postulates that the question of aesthetics is fundamentally the question of labor. Whenever we think about the aesthetics, then we think that labor is something different, aesthetics is something different. But I am saying that how whenever aesthetics is fundamentally the question of labor, the production of values. Ultimately, what these performers are doing, they are trying to produce some kinds of values. So for example, if one is doing a ritual, then by doing a ritual, you are producing some kinds of values. The values can be very, very enslaving. The values can be many times very, very progressive, but ultimately you are producing some kinds of values. And therefore your production is ultimately somewhere incorporating to some kinds of labor. So it is this bondage between culture and labor that aestheticize laboring bodies in their exhaustive work environment and performative context. The society produces a condition of performativity in which the body and work can only be realized through cultural performances. While the body becomes an actor, work becomes a labor, resonating the eternal production of creative and cosmological values. Workers have to be played their roles or assigned caste roles to get the production values use of their works recognized. In other words, the merit of works do not exist outside their assigned roles. And if you are thinking about the whole range of folk performances, then you will realize that only they get recognized when they are playing within the caste roles. Once they are trying to cross the caste roles, then the values gets completely devalued in that other sense. So while caste society as a whole habitually functions in a performative context, it is only in the performance context that one can imagine and think of reversal or subversion of these roles. The performance of cultural labor are potentially so double-edged in their consequences that they can neither be appreciated nor can be escaped in the production of new culture. And therefore, like no, one can say that, oh my God, like no, folk performance is so revolutionary, so radical. I don't go with that kinds of argument. But again, other will say like no, even you have like no criticism coming from Dalit and Bahujana scholars, they will say that let us completely discard this whole field of folk performance. I think that is also extreme kinds of a step, because whole idea is that how we can reclaim some of those values. So I will just give you an idea, the kinds of landscape that I was working. So it was a folk world of beliefs. It was an animated world of spirits and energies. Like now, suppose if you are taking a spirits or ghost as a kind of like, no, this is a superstitious kinds of belief. But suppose if you are just taking those spirits as agencies, because like go to Tamil Nadu, and I think maybe some of you are coming from Tamil Nadu and different parts of India also, you will find that many of the deities are under lock. They are, like, if you're going to the big temples, then you will find that many of the deities who are coming from the local communities, they are put under the lock. So what does it mean when they are trying to put some deities under lock? Is it like, no, you are trying to put some deities under lock? I will say that you are trying to put, like if you're trying to lock, then you are trying to lock the agency of that communities. And if you're trying to read these spirits, deities, agencies of the communities, then I think we can get more kinds of reading and more. It was a folk world of belief. It was an animated world of spirits and energies. Places had stories. The tree had spirits and a spirit had names. The names had spiritual qualities associated with them. It was a forest of signs and symbols. It was an incredible complex network of stories. It was a terrifying world of spirits, deities, shamans, and witches. Spirits were oppressed, deities were victims, witches were the weakest, and shamans were the powerful healers. It was a world of deformed deities and displaced souls trying to find their own solace in human imagination. On the one side, the spiritual world was frightening and enslaving. On the other side, it was also empowering and enabling. One who believed in that world also accumulated immense power. They could see forests moving and mountains dancing. They could mobilize the symbols at will. It enables people to fight the higher enemies. It enables members to cooperate and work as a community. With such animated power, Dina and Bhadri, who comes from like Musar communities in Bihar, so if you're thinking about larger movement and how this movement unfolded in Bihar, then Dina and Bhadri, both were the kinds of cult figures, and both the figures becomes very, very important, like significant figures in Bihar, especially in Bihar region. And then we will find that like even during the Marxist, like the Maoist movement in Bihar, people were not saying that Mao, Lenin, Jindabad, they were saying Dina Bhadri Baba ki jai. And how Dina Bhadri was becoming a kind of very political figure. But if you are just trying to diminish this figure as a kind of like some kinds of superstitious deities or that kinds of beliefs, then maybe we are also missing the whole political kinds of reading of those deities who can also mobilize the communities who are not many times educated. Just to give you another kinds of like so also different kinds of beliefs, because when we are talking about the beliefs, then beliefs is not just about like right beliefs and wrong beliefs. It is also about symbols. It's also about mobilizing power of the communities, because one of the things that we really need at a kind of like time of the crisis, that how we are going to mobilize the communities. And we have like experiences from UP where we will find that how the communities have been mobilized for different kinds of epic, through different kinds of narrative, and how the whole epics and narrative have been created through now new kinds of political kinds of inputs. So, and this, I would like to read this part, and after that we can move to the I would go to the paper. The flocks of crows, crows would come in the morning. They would fill the soundscape with their cawing orchestra. Many times you would get irritated. It's about crow, it's about kawa. And many times we would read them as messengers. Some would ask them to jump and tell who is coming. By seeing how the crow jumped, they would decipher the movement of the guest. In the sound, they would find the message. But a dark black crow would be a bad omen, a signal that someone has died or someone is going to die. Words would have a caste. So if you're coming from any parts of India, they know that how animals, words, they all have their castes. So words would have caste. Animals would have names. Trees would have figures. Not only living beings, but ordinary objects were also supposed to possess living and lives and spirits. The broom deity had to be kept properly, or else she would get angry. The kitchenware would gossip once people went to sleep. The sickle would sing, and the trowel would go to dancing in the field. It was an animated world, a world of sensorium, where senses could have been mobilized at will. So one of the things that I am trying to do in this book is that how to go beyond the language, because one of our limitation had been that whenever we think about music, then we are also trying to think music in terms of language. But I think that is a very, very limiting way of understanding the things. How to bring the gesture, how to bring the posture, how to bring the symbols that can also helps in mobilizing the community, that also helps in creating new kinds of narratives. So this has been a part of larger idea that I was thinking in terms of cultural labor, and I will just you go to the paper that I was discussing, and where I'm saying musical unfreedom, how our own enslavement, so what is happening in the folk performances, that many times it has huge potential, it has a lot of potential, but if you're going to dance more, then there is a chance that you are going to get more marginalized. So suppose if you're Shah Rukh Khan, if you are coming from Bollywood, and if you are if you are a star, and if you're just doing a one pose, then you are able to produce a lot of cultural capital. You are able to produce a capital in a real sense. You are able to make a lot of money. But here, what is happening in the kinds of landscape, that if you are going to dance, then maybe there is a chance that you are going to marginalize yourself. As much as you are going to dance, you are going to further marginalize yourself. Then unless you are not coming out of these kinds of obligation, and this happens in a kinds of caste service and the caste obligation, and unless we are not able to break that boundary of the caste service and caste obligation, then there is a chance that as much as you will perform, it will only produce your own kinds of enslavement. And we have now examples coming from different parts of India, from Telangana, from Tamil Nadu, where for example, Dappu got new kinds of re-significations. So Dappu has become a new kinds of political instrument, but Dappu was only able to come out of this kinds of caste service, then only it was able to produce a new kinds of values. So what I'm doing in this paper is called musical unfreedom and drummer's dilemma. And I will read some parts, and after that we can have a discussion. So while in my previous work on cultural labor, I focused on the question of what performers produce. Here, my question concerns how performance produce performer's identity. So for instance, how one who plays a musical instrument, baja becomes bajaniya, or one who plays mandar becomes manariya, or one who dance, do some kinds of dance become nachaniya. So how your performance produce your own kinds of subjective identity in that sense. So what is the cultural economy of this production? Most specifically, I ask, what does music do to the social identity? In answering this, I reflect on social and cultural identity constructed through music in a caste-based society. What could have been a creative expression of freedom turns into an expression of unfreedom in its very ritualized and embodied process. So whatever could have been a whole creative kinds of very strong creative field, by participating in that field, you are able to produce your own kinds of unfreedom. And therefore, this whole idea of the musical unfreedom, it is very musical, it is very passionate, it is very effective in that sense, but at the same time, you are producing your own kinds of enslavement. I term the cultural context as the musical unfreedom and the resultant performative contradiction as the drummer's dilemma. So whether musical unfreedom complicates this problem of freedom and unfreedom in the performative context of South Asia, and analyze the problem through the conceptual framework of cultural labor, in which culture and labor can be viewed as co-producing activities that constitute a site of transformative potentials, but also of enslavement. So now the question for drummer is not about drumming and not drumming. Drumming, for drummers, the question is that drum and not drum becomes a very, very political questions. If you're going to drum, then there is a chance that you are going to further strengthen the caste society, and that is what generally happens. I analyze this problem of musical freedom. So I take like 3 examples here in this case, and you have examples coming from Charans in Gujarat. So what happens in Charans in Gujarat? So whenever they discuss about like their own kinds of narrative, then Charans will be very, very happy to discuss about genealogy. They will give that, oh my God, we have like a very interesting kinds of genealogy. We have such a like rich, glorious genealogy. But when they ask about music, then they try to make a distance with the music. The question comes that why the communities who try to make a certain kinds of connection with the genealogy, but try to get away with this whole idea of the music. So what music does? It means music is doing something to the identity. Music, even we find that in many caste communities, the people who are producing music, they get more marginalized. So even within the like Dalit communities, the people who are producing music, they get more marginalized. So what music is exactly doing? What kinds of music is able to like how music is able to produce some kinds of marginality that only music does. And this becomes a kind of question that I can try to unravel in this paper. So traditional caste-based forms of music in South Asia are perhaps the most valuable as well as least valuable services in Indian society. Any attempt to make sense of the value of music becomes a real enigma, surrounded by factors such as taste, location, labor, as well as the larger context in which music and performance are placed in a caste-feudal society. I situate the value of music in the framework of the dilemmas and values it engenders for the marginalized communities. As I argue in this context, music produces a condition of musical unfreedom. However, to drum or not to drum is not a matter of choice. It is rather a service condition in which performers are placed. Music becomes the social marker and immediate mode of identification for the caste and communities of performer. It is important to ask what is the relationship between music and the social. Because performers not only produce music, but in the process, they also produce themselves. And you have like a scholar like Simon Freeth, and he asked this very interesting question. The question he said that question we should be asking is not what does popular music reveal about the people, but how does it construct them? How music construct communities. And when we are discussing about communities and music in Indian society, then I think this question becomes very, very like a strong question that how music, it is not about how communities are producing music, but how music is producing communities. And unless we are thinking in terms of like caste society where like these two things, service and obligation, remains the whole part of the hierarchy, unless the music is not able to cut out of itself from this idea of the service, caste service and caste obligation, I think it will not be able to produce certain kinds of emancipations. So Dalits and other lower caste who engage with such music as professionals are considered even lower than their lower caste equivalents. Why do they get marginalized when they come in contact with music? What is the materiality of music that marginalizes their social status further? What is the materiality of musical instruments that not only denigrates the instrument and its rhythm, but also it's the individuals and community who own and play them? Though the question can be extended to other performing arts as well, dance and theater as well, there is something very specific to music and its distinct, like distinct politics and aesthetics. Most importantly, as Mason, who is a scholar, he asked, the world, like world music history should be told through the prism of labor and dignity. And this is my overarching focus, has been in this focus because, and if you are interested, then I can pass this paper to all of you. So caste society creates a paradoxical situation in which singers and musicians are considered the lowest of the low, but their music is considered many times a special offering. Like if you're going to temple, then the same communities are offering like music, and the music is able to create the whole values, because that music, the deities will not arrive, the spirit will not happen, and the worship cannot take place. But the person who are singing, people who are singing gets marginalized. So what is this whole contradiction that is happening in terms of like this kinds of production? So both an ultimate offering and ultimate obedience, because you are not only producing the ultimate offering, but you are also producing the ultimate obedience. Like if you're thinking in terms of caste society, how is it possible that some cultural activities remain exceedingly musical, for example, dancing and drumming, but dreadfully unfree? And yet very like unfree in the real economic sense. If you're thinking about economic gain, they are really getting nothing in sense of like wages and other things. So while I argue here that while an important concept, like I don't think we have much time. How much time we have? Yeah, so if you can mute, unmute and can tell me the time, then I can.
So you can take 15 minutes more.
Okay, all right. So I use cultural labor as a conceptual framework to discuss the problematics that produces this paradoxical relationship that like, no, your production is becoming the highest values, but your bodies are becoming completely getting marginalized. The framework focuses on the particular problem in which performance, despite holding enormous potential, gets devalued in the hegemonic aesthetic regime. On various occasions, such performance lead to the passionate production of values, but also the enslavement of the musician as they become servitude in performance. I term this problematic musical unfreedom. Analyzing it is a cultural process that entangles the problem of freedom and unfreedom in a specific social context. So while lack of freedom is the like a primary condition of cultural labor. So whenever we think about cultural labor, and one of the contexts, like whenever we think about like folk performances, then folk performances also is like one can think about folk performance based on Ramayana and Mahabharata. You also have folk performances that come from upper caste communities. But where we discuss about the folk performances, then how the folk performances of the Dalit and Bahujan community becomes different. And I will say the lack of freedom is the one context in which we can think about how Dalit and Bahujan community produce these kinds of music. So I was giving an example of Charans of Gujarat. So what happens that Charans, what they do, that Charan place themselves in. So whenever they comes to the narrative, so they will say that we are the poets, but we are not musicians. So this is quite a strange paradox. Even in Bihar, now they will say that we are Vyas. So we are singing, we are the Vyas, coming from that Vyas tradition. But if you are going to tell them that Gavaiya, then they will say that no, we are not Gavaiya, we are Vyas. So why you want to become a poet, but you don't want to become a musician? So this is one of the contradictions that becomes very, very evident when we discuss about the Charan communities in Gujarat. So, and therefore singing, one want to become a singing professionals, but not a professional singers. So you want to become a singing professional, but not a professional singers. And this becomes one of the contradictions that we can discuss about when we are discussing about more larger idea of the Dalit and Bahujan community. Because if you're thinking about more kinds of folk performances in communities, then these contradictions are also becoming very, very strong, where they will say that they will try to associate themselves with the poet, but not with the music. The second context when I discuss about the Manaria. Manaria are drummers, they do. So Manaria who perform on the occasion of the lower caste ritual practices are not so they are the people who practice perform during the lower caste rituals in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh during the Bhunya Puja and other kinds of performances, but they are not generally considered lower. So you are not necessarily when we are discussing about the Dalit and Bahujan community, then not necessarily all the communities are getting marginalized in the equal and in the same ways. So Manaria who perform on the occasion of the lower caste ritual practices are not disparaged during the performance because of the inter-caste shared cultural spaces. So you have Manaria come from the Dalit communities. They many times also come from the OBC communities, and many times we also have the shared space and shared narratives. And in that shared narratives, Manaria gets a very high values. So even they're that kinds of offerings that they are doing in terms of music. So not only musicians who are getting some kinds of values, even if they are making some kinds of offering. So both here, offering and musicians both are getting a equally high values. So in one context, what is happening that if you are performing for the upper caste, then your values are offerings are getting recognized very much. Your offering can be considered the highest offering, but you as a musician are not considered the highest in that sense. You are getting more marginalized. Here, what happens that you are performing for a more Dalit and Bahujan communities in a more ritualized space also, then what is happening that your both offerings are also getting recognized as well as your music are also getting recognized. And here we can find some kinds of potentials of potential for emancipation. That is what I'm trying to find out, that even within these kinds of very ritualized space, there are spaces where we can find some kinds of potential. And here we can find that how intra-community spaces of the Dalit Bahujans, you have Manaria who are performing for either Dalits or OBC communities, and they are still sharing some kinds of narrative, very interesting narratives, where they can make some kinds of interesting kinds of interludes, where both the poetry, narratives, and music both are getting equally recognized. And third part comes from Chamar communities from again UP and Bihar, where they are drumming or performing on the occasions of inauspicious occasions. So what happens, like, still this community remains very much part of the musical services, because like, generally they are hired for their musical services, and whenever their musical services are needed, their bodily presence becomes a problem. And in many parts of India, drummers are referred as bhajaniya. In like North India also, they are like no. So what happens in the case of bhajaniya, their social identity gets reduced to the musical identity. The whole social identity gets completely reduced to the musical identity. And in the formation of musical social identity of chamars, therefore music and leather both becomes a kinds of like markers. To summarize, like and just to like make some kinds of summarization, we can discuss about like tonality. One can discuss about softness and hardness of the music, because the loudness of the music becomes the one of the criteria that like generally the aesthetics regime and Indian aesthetics regime does not have that kinds of a space. So what is the materiality of music that marginalizes the musician in their three contexts? I have discussed about three contexts: context of charan, the context of manaria, and the context of like a chamar caste who plays on like in auspicious occasions. So I will try to just summarize this part. And so labor in the form of service is a very much part of the musical production and consumption. And that is why like when we are not recognizing the question of labor, then we are also not recognizing the question of service. Because you will find that many post-colonial scholars, many upper caste scholars, they will discuss about service. They will say, oh, we have entering in the service kinds of economy. Whenever they will discuss about globalization, when they discuss about neoliberalism, they will say that, oh, service industry, we are living in the age of service industry. But why you are not recognizing the service industry of your own caste society? And once you are recognizing this service and obligation, then whole problems gets completely located. And therefore, and when you are recognizing this notion of service and obligation, then you also need to recognize the question of labor. Labor in the form of service is a very much part of the musical production and consumption. In caste society, music is less about artistic production and more about service and obligation. It exists in the forms of service to a deity. It can be a service to judgments. It is a form of service to pay the ritual debt. And once music becomes an obligation, it also becomes an unfreedom. And therefore, the whole idea of Dalit Bahujan emancipation should be, like as a mission, should be that how to bring this music out of obligation, how to bring this part, like kinds of music and performing, like performing arts out of these kinds of service economy, caste service economy. And once music becomes an obligation, it also becomes an unfreedom. It may happen that as much as communities perform and participate in such music, they may produce their own enslavement. Thus, it can be argued that to drum and or not to drum is not a matter of choice. It is rather a service condition of performance in which performers are placed. This service has to be performed as a part of the very maintenance of the caste society. Music does not seem to have its independent existence outside of the service in a caste society. The drummer's dilemma is a question that seeks to ask aesthetico-political response from performers, audience, and academics. In that sense, performance becomes a trap. Here, if you're thinking about performance, then performance becomes a trap, something that is inescapable, but at the same time, the only possible mode of articulation to think about freedom. So one way of saying is that, like, no, go with this idea of the anti-performance, that whatever caste society performs, we are going against that kinds of regime of performance and those regime of aesthetics. But again, if you are thinking about some kinds of emancipation, then imagination, the idea of the performance again becomes an intrinsic idea. And therefore, we need to think that how to get this music, these kinds of performance out of the service and obligation economy, and again, think performance in a new way. So then the whole idea would be that how to make certain kinds of like a deep cut in these kinds of service economy, music and performance based on the service economy, and to produce a new kinds of culture, and not new kinds of culture in terms of only, I will say, Buddhist music or Ambedkarite music. Of course, that is providing a strong alternative, but also think in terms of potentialities that can come within the folk performances by severing or breaking the link from the folk performances itself. So that was a kind of my presentation. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for giving me this opportunity and hearing me patiently.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Brahma Prakash. And almost it is more than 50 minutes. I would say that no, he presented well, and it is more insightful. There are two parts of his lecture. First part deals with a context in which he is engaged with the theater, music, cultural labor, where he was discussing about his recent book, Cultural Labor, published by Oxford. So this is the book which is getting more appreciation, and really people are taking seriously. And the second part of his lecture is, this I think consistently was talking musical unfreedom, how it is linked with the service economy, so the labor, so performer identity, how the relation between performer and music, how it is interrelated in determining the performer identity. So he has given three examples from Gujarat, Bihar, and other part. So in a way, in second part of his lecture, he has given many interesting and insights, which I think helpful for us to think, taking our own context, our own state, experiences where we are located. So there are a couple of things that one can think about around. I think I'm just trying to pick up some points so that everybody will get a sense. And meanwhile, I request every participants both within the Zoom meeting on Facebook, so you can have a questions. You can have a questions. I'm just Brahma Prakash in his presentation. So there is no always. I mean, just you said in caste-ridden society, music doesn't have its own independence. So it is something to do with obligation. When it is something to do with obligation, obviously music does not get its independent recognition and its aesthetic values. So while it is true that it only differs from where this music is, which community is produced. Take for example, a Brahmin producing Karnataka music, it has its own value. It depends only which community, which person from his social location is producing. You are right, absolutely. That the within the Bhujan communities, Dalit communities, they don't have a some, at least some music traditions historically rooted to service the village rituals, other communities. But I give you two examples from Telugu region. In Telangana, Madigas generally they play Dappu, and there was a incident where, and most of the Madigas are educated, they are not playing the Dappu. But in the village, the upper caste began to demand playing Dappu for their death rituals. And in the Madiga said, no, our children's no more playing, we are old and we can't play it. And what they had did is they are boycotted entire Madiga community from the village. I mean, you are right in that context. But there is a dialectic. Madigas, in one sense, resisting not to play. It's assertion. So upper caste are demanding as it is a service to them. So there is a rupture. I mean, there is a conflict between hegemony of the upper caste, the assertion of the Dalits, particularly on the playing, not playing the drum. This is one. The second is, I think one is leisure and music, and the labor and music. Now you take all the upper caste, particularly whether you take Carnatic music or the kind of instruments, the associated with the Brahmanical traditions are all rooted with the leisure. If you take any drum or any musical instrument produced by the Bohujan communities and Dalit communities, Adivasi communities, they are inevitably rooted into their production relations. Because music instruments, the making of music instruments is a precondition for the producing the music. Of course, except singing and all that things. So one has to see that link also. The second thing is determining the identity is also one of the very, very important point that you made. I think when you say determining the identity, how so one is institutional engagement. All the theater arts departments of theater arts, all the departments of music in entire India, whichever university you take, if you study them, I think you will come across a picture how certain theater, art, and the music is encouraged and hegemonized by some communities within the institutions. Why? Because that's where how institutions also created a hierarchy between the music and their performers. So there are a couple of points, but I stop here. I request the audience to think and respond to the.
Can I briefly say 2 points? Just very briefly, I will make 2 points. Yeah. So yeah, you're right. That is the whole point. I'm trying to make this connection that whenever we discuss about aesthetics, we also discuss about autonomy. This whole modernity and autonomy is very much associated. But what happens in a caste society that even art does not have autonomy in a real sense, because it cannot become autonomous. It still remains a very much part of the kinds of production that society demands from that. And same we can also discuss about more tourism industry now, because you are rightly pointing out that even many times some kinds of rupture and break is happening, that many times with the tourism many communities are getting some kinds of services, but again how this service, the caste service and tourism service, are also reciprocating each other, complementing each other in that sense, and without breaking not necessarily breaking the boundaries, but also without breaking the boundary, one service economy is entering into the other mode of the service economy, and continuity somewhere, it also provides certain kinds of continuity. Yeah, but thank you so much. Yeah, I can take. Yeah, thank you for your brilliant comments. Yeah.
So I request audience to respond with their questions. Directly you can ask, or otherwise you can message to speaker.
I have some questions, if
yeah
permits. Firstly, thank you, Dr. Brahma Prakash, for your brilliant conversation. I've read your book, and I think you have spoken even at CSSS and several other places. So it's it was really wonderful engaging with you. I found your talk very interesting, particularly when you were talking about what music does to a community, and the entire aspect of the musical unfreedom, which even Chandraya was talking about. Not going much into details or comments on that, I want to ask, like, firstly, when you talk about the aspect of transgression, the possibility of transgression within the musical tradition, and somewhere you said that this transgression is limited. Because the kind of production that Dalit Bahujan musical tradition produce doesn't get acceptance beyond a certain kind of communitarian, beyond a certain kind of community, or without beyond their community as such. However, I wanted to ask you, when we look into the popular culture, particularly the new popular culture which is emerging, be it the ala tradition of music, like there is, I'm talking about Uttar Pradesh, for instance, there is this entire ala tradition of music, or birha tradition of music, dhola tradition of music, the different traditions of music which have its roots in folk, but it is constantly negotiating and renegotiating with the spaces in popular. So for instance, if you happen to listen to Seema Azad, she's one of the very popular ala singer. She has a lot of views on YouTube, for instance, like millions of views, which is obviously possible when that music transgresses the community. And also, like for example, if you look into birha tradition of music, the birha is constantly renegotiating the spaces of the traditional aspect in which the music itself was produced. So when you talk about this entire aspect of musical unfreedom, or the constraining aspect of music, that it fails to somewhere transgress the community, how far is it possible, particularly in the time when there is a lot of contested spaces that is emerging within popular culture? So that is one thing I wanted to ask. And related to this, I also wanted to ask about this entire thing about dhappu, which you talked about. So you said, like, I don't know if I got you right, but if dhappu is produced beyond the traditions in which it is traditionally practiced, it somewhere fails to capture the essence of the community, as well as it fails to it becomes somewhere like a farce. So is it so? Because when we look into the new kind of popular culture, or even cinematic traditions that is emerging, they are constantly using these musical instruments. If you can just briefly talk about it, or you can enlighten us with that. And the second question I wanted to ask, sir, it was that somewhere you talked about I mean, even in your book, you discuss the cultural labor and cultural labor, and you talk about the labor aspect of the music, which is somewhere very much ingrained within the anthropological dimension of the music, somewhere, or it is ingrained in the social of the music, but how do we make sense of the everydayness of the music? Because uh, when for instance, when I was working on music, this whole thing came, like, for women, it was not just the music was not just about their land, or it was not just about a social visibility, but it was also very personal, because it created a new sense of meanings for themselves, for their own identities, and the newer ways in which they can imagine their identities. So how do we, like, when you talk about this entire aspect of cultural labor of music, how do we locate the everydayness of music in that? And like, lastly, I just wanted to ask, like, in your book, you have used this word subaltern. And like, here in the talk, you are constantly using the word Dalit Bahujan. So how far, like, how can we use how carefully should we be using these terms? So if you can just talk about it. Thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you, Chandriya, for organizing.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kalyani. We always have like a very deep discussion. So I think this is in continuation of that discussion that we are having here. So that you are right, that like, if you're thinking about more popular music that is getting circulated on like YouTube, and maybe like, even we are thinking about Dappu, then I think that you are framing the things in the right way. And how it is happening, that because the popular music is not part of the service economy, caste service economy, because it is not caring, like it is not doing for some Brahmin caste, it is not doing for like, it's not part of the ritualized space, and therefore it generates its own potential to get out of, like become the part of, get its own circulation out of the communities. And many times, even if you're thinking about Birha Alha, then Birha Alha tradition in North India was never a community specific kinds of performances. It was like, no. So if you're going to like, and also the same, it's not the same concept. So if you're going to UP, then Birha had a more valor kinds of singing, more valor kinds of singing. It's all about assertion, it's all about many times masculinity and other things. But if you're going to Madhya Pradesh, then same Birha becomes a love epic, love kinds of singing. It's become about romance. And then Birha becomes more like intra-communitarian in the Madhya Pradesh region, because the whole genre has a different kinds of take there. Here in Uttar Pradesh, because it's more about the epic kinds of tradition, it's more about the valor, that it becomes more about the identity, caste identity, where the things gets asserted. But what is happening now, so you will find that a lot of like Yadavs, for example, in UP and other castes, many other castes, they generally become the kinds of stars of Birha tradition or Biraha tradition for that matter. So it shows some kinds of whole identity that get constituted through like Biraha kinds of that masculinity. And many times they also have a singing about Pakistan, about all kinds of things that you must have listened. So I'm saying that because this is precisely that music are not part of the service economy, and therefore it opens up the possibilities to become and cross and transgress that idea of the communities. And that always happens with the popular kinds of music. And so unless if you're whatever the music I was discussing, either I was discussing about Charan, I was discussing about Chamar caste community, Chamar communities, I was discussing about Manaria, they all are very much part of the service economy within the caste. And like many times for the upper caste, many times for the even like Bahujan, Dalit Bahujan caste. And therefore I was discussing in a service economy context. So here you are getting a different dimension. Second, about Dappu become possible, like Dappu now many castes are performing Dappu in Telangana, and we have like many scholars from Telangana here, and they are the better place to say many things. But again, because it got a new kinds of political signification, and therefore because it was able to break its chain from the caste communities. Of course, like Madhika can claim that this is our instrument and nobody can say that it is not theirs. But at the same time, with the new kinds of radical political signification, Dappu has also got a new kinds of meaning, new kinds of values, and new kinds of musicality for that matter. And therefore it is able to surpass that kinds of I will say transgress that kinds of communities ideas. And coming back to your idea of the everydayness, this is a very complex question. I don't think that I have answer, but I think that many times what is happening in that very many time in the post-colonial and post-modernist discourse, this whole idea of the everydayness gets very much valorized. That everydayness is a kind of a struggle, and what let us think about everydayness. But if you are thinking about political kinds of event, then everydayness not necessarily a very viable option. It can be part of the everydayness. You are able to provide some kinds of alternative, some kinds of transgression, but not necessarily you are able to break or make a certain kinds of cut into the politics. And therefore, you have an interesting work by this person, the production of a space. I think I'm just forgetting the name of that sociologist. Break or make a certain kind.
Lefebvre.
Sorry, Lefebvre, yeah. So Lefebvre make very interesting points in this whole idea of the rhythm analysis. He wrote a very interesting book, Rhythm Analysis, and he's saying that festival is the idea and his whole work is about critique of everyday life. Because whole idea, I think even one of the things should be part of the politics is that critique of everyday life. Because if you're thinking about caste regime and any kinds of cultural regime, then how culture becomes part of everyday life. And therefore one critique should be that how critique of everyday life becomes a kind of one aim. And therefore, he provides that how during the festival, we become a part of some different kinds of temporal and spatial kinds of category. And therefore, through that category, we are able to provide certain kinds of critique to everyday life. And one way of thinking about everyday life would be to thinking about critique of like no everyday life becomes a like no thinking about some kinds of politics itself becomes a critique of everyday life. Any radical politics would become a part of critique of everyday life. Now, like suppose like I can think about many Adivasi communities, many communities for that matter, even like let us talk about upper caste like community. They may be singing some kinds of song like bhakti songs and very like very interesting bhakti songs. And then one can say that okay, there is a certain kinds of distribution of sensibilities one can think about. But if you are thinking about in terms of political programs, then I still think there is a limitation in which one can think that like how much it can go beyond that. Because one point you will find that oh my god, what an interesting progressive song, and second sentence like second minute they are some completely subverting the whole ideas, and it goes together, and whole contradiction many times goes together. And I cannot read like everydayness as a kinds of political category, because everydayness is always mixed. It is always a kinds of some kinds of like negotiation that is happening. And therefore, yeah, so one way of thinking about everydayness is a kind of very radical critical idea that many scholars tend to do. I will go away with that kinds of approach. I will say that like no, in terms of certain kinds of political and political event, I think we need to provide a certain kinds of lens, certain kinds of perspective, just that should provide a critique to everyday life or everydayness in that sense. And now that question that I've been asked many times about subaltern communities and Dalit Bahujan, why I'm using Dalit Bahujans now and why I have used like subaltern communities for that matter. It becomes like two, three kinds of like one, that if you're thinking about folk communities, largely folk communities, even folk communities who are coming from marginalized, like who are very marginalized, then they are not having many times very Dalit Chetna or Bahujan Chetna for that matter. It is not the music and performing arts coming from that kinds of political category. For example, the kinds of work you are doing, and you can say that okay, Kalyani is doing like maybe Dalit Bahujan kinds of music. She's working on Dalit Bahujan kinds of performing arts and those traditions. But when I was discussing, then these are the like spaces where you don't have that kinds of chetna. You don't have that kinds of consciousness, and therefore unnecessarily like maybe bringing Dalit and Bahujan and claiming them that is a part of certain kinds of political category becomes problematic in itself. And then I will say that okay, so what is the kinds of area you have been working on? I can say that okay, it is Dalit Bahujan, like largely it addresses the question of Dalit Bahujan communities, but Dalit Bahujan communities who may not be the part of that political programs yet. And when they are not the part of the Dalit and Bahujan political programs, then I think many times I will have my own apprehension to whether to say it's Dalit Bahujan kinds of project or whether it's a subaltern kinds of like subaltern communities who are producing these kinds of music, which many times becomes very, very problematic, full of problems and full of its own kinds of like complexities. So that was the one reason. Second, that even subaltern communities were thinking about Dalit Bahujan, then you have also, for example, subaltern communities, when I'm also not using the subaltern groups the way historians have used. So again, I'm very beginning, I'm making this distinction that I'm not using the way like Sumit Sarkar, the way Partho Chatterjee and other scholars have used. I am using in a different ways to bring other communities who are in a marginalized space, but not necessarily are coming under the Chetna of Dalit Bahujans. So maybe I'm trying to provide this answer, but yeah, we can have a disagreement and kinds of agreement also.
Thank you so much. I mean, I agree with what you said. It's just that like 2-3 things, maybe I'll clarify it later. Okay. Thank you so much.
So others can also ask.
I think Ajit Kumar is trying to ask some questions, but he's muted.
Ajit, you can unmute yourself.
Okay. Over. I forgot to unmute.
Yes, sir.
Now a question to you, only single question. You said music has no freedom. Am I right? If you said so?
Music has no.
You say this music has no freedom.
Yeah.
Okay. If you confess that what you said is your view, I like to contest. Say, for example, if you take that folk music in Telangana, not even today, even right from 1920s onwards, the folk music has played very important revolutionary role, even in Telangana armed struggle, as well as yesterday's, separate Telangana movement. There is a lot of freedom for music, in my view.
Yeah, I agree with you that, like, of course, like when we discuss about music or any art for that matter, then of course it has a lot of freedom, it has a lot of potential. I am discussing music primarily in a kinds of service context, caste society context, and that is primarily my side. So you are right. I quite agree with you that music has played a very emancipatory roles and like all kinds of different kinds of roles in Telangana movement, many other kinds of movement, even within India. But when we are discussing about the music caste society, and music in the context of ritualized context, then it becomes difficult. And then also, I'm not saying that it does not have like no freedom at all. Freedom and non-freedom, like no unfreedom, goes together. That would be my take, and that is the way I am trying to argue in cultural labor. That cultural labor, site of cultural labor, is full of potentials, but the potentials can be emancipatory as well as enslaving. Neither I'm not saying that this way or that way is the only like no possible ways. I'm saying that, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, so I think,
So
yeah.
I think people are maybe preparing. So I'm just, this is a general question. So you can think, because since you are engaged, so how anybody or for that matter scholars have began to distinguish between classical and folk traditions? What are the characteristics that distinguish between classical and folk? This is a general question.
Yeah.
And the second one is the unfreedom that we are talking in the caste service economy. While it is true, but still we have to think the stigmatized identity that is determined to the performer and music, the unfreedom that performer exercise, not because of performer uncreativity, it is because of external factor. So the externality is no outside of his agency.
Yeah.
So therefore, when he resists, the only possibility is conflict. There is a second process where they are creatively also negate this obligation. Take for example, in the Telangana, after Dandora movement, MRPS, popularly known as MRPS movement, they this is a Dandora movement by the Madigas. They took playing drum symbol to their movement. So from the beginning, they began to articulate that we are the creators of the music. Forget about stigmatizing, degrading performers. We are the creators of the music. So we made the music instruments. Therefore, our contribution to the music world is greater than the so-called classical music. So, so that's where one has to see how the unfreedom is, interrogated.
Yeah, so that you are, I quite agree with you, because even in my book I see that many times what happens that one performance or music can be creatively very powerful, creatively very potentially powerful, very powerful, but again politically it can be very problematic. Now, how to read these kinds of things? where like music or performing arts for that matter, creatively very, very powerful, but politically it can be very, very problematic. But so how to read the agency? Can we just read the agency through the political kinds of category, or can we also try to read the agency through certain kinds of creativity, certain kinds of bodily incorporeality? And that way I agree with you that like, this whole idea that when we are discussing about freedom, so when Madigas, like you are rightly pointing out that how Madigas, for that matter, now reclaiming that we are the producer of the music, we are the creator of the music, and once it is getting reclaimed on its own condition, the way communities want to reclaim on its own kinds of like political kinds of like context, then the whole idea of the things are getting subverted, and then like you have Madiga communities who earlier were seen as, oh my God, they are the people who are playing music. But now the same communities are saying that, no, we are the people who play music. Then the political context has completely changed. With these kinds of new political claims, this whole thing has completely changed. And therefore, what was unfreedom earlier now becoming the site of freedom. So I think, yeah, so this idea that when I'm discussing about freedom and unfreedom, then I think both it is also carries certain kinds of like, it is full of certain kinds of potentialities, and that is what I am trying to indicate towards, that even if you are thinking about these kinds of music tradition that is full of problems many times, but there is a possibility to reclaim those traditions, and it is happening in Tamil Nadu with like Opari songs. It is happening in like Telangana and many parts of like Uttar Pradesh. So I think there is a potential which we can politicize, and once it get politicized, then there is a kinds of possibility that we can reclaim that kinds of music or performing arts for that matter.
So
but yeah,
I think
it was a very like a brief kinds of presentation that way. It was a very thick book. If you are interested, we can have a discussion, and if you can ask somebody is interested, they can ask me question on later occasions, and I would love to have these kinds of discussion.
So Ajit, would you like to ask questions? Anybody? Gogu Shamala from she's one of the very important scholar, and she's a fellow in Paris now, and she also works on a lot of folk performances, women's studies. So anybody would like to ask questions? So otherwise we can conclude.
Yeah, I think it has been quite late now. People must be very tired.
Okay. So, but anyhow, it was really. So I'm just concluding, since there are no questions, comments. With this, I think Dr. Brahma Prakash presentation is really gave a productive beginning to continue this lecture series. So hopefully we will engage with more emerging scholars, as well as the scholars who are already working on this field. So I feel personally, because I come from a political science, I work on Dalit studies and Dalit literature. So this is the field in general within the Bahujan discourse, the Dalit discourse. This is the field which is largely not discussed much, as if music is only a concern of the upper caste. So only the Carnatic music and other musics are discussed more, and most of these Bahujan musical traditions are reduced to the only folk, and therefore it's local. The minute you say folk and there is an implicit meaning, it is a local. Now, what is national? I think one has to question. What what make a music national? What is its component? Who makes it's national? Is one. The minute you say folk, and there is an implicit meaning is non-aesthetic. So as if aesthetics are related to the only, classical. I think any sensible person could see lot of aesthetics and meaningful aesthetics with the folk traditions. It is their, hegemonic outlook that deliberately, undermine the aesthetic, creativity, skillful, its social meaning of the music. I think that's where most of the, though there is an element of entertainment within the Bausan musical tradition, and largely there historically the music traditions that they have invoked, performed, have a social relevance. I think that's where they have contributed a lot to the, music traditions, instruments, performance, theater, with the social vision of the, art. So with this note, we'll continue to engage, and on behalf of Satyashodak, we thank Dr. Brahma Prakash, and we will definitely have a conversation. So I request Brahma Prakash to circulate his paper, so that I will communicate to and circulate to others, so that people will read it. And this video we will upload on YouTube, and you can watch it on Satyashodak YouTube channel with the Ambedkar profile picture. So immediately you can watch it on Satyashodak Facebook page. So with this, I thank Dr. Brahma Prakash for spending his valuable time and his work. I also thank all the participants in the Zoom meeting, and on Facebook also, on many people are watching. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity and organizing this program. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'm concluding.